Hi, I'm Dr. David A. Paprota, Executive Director of Critical Concepts and Strategies, CCS Test Prep, and retired Chief of Police. I've created this video to help candidates who have made it through a selection process and are moving on to the clinical psychological assessment. This is the process in which you've made it past the point of being selected for the position, possibly even given a formal written conditional offer of employment from the hiring agency, and now you're being subjected to a psychological assessment to move on to the hiring process. This also goes along with generally a medical exam as well, to where you're being sent to a medical doctor for a medical assessment and to a professionally trained psychologist or psychiatrist for this psychological assessment. Again, it's clinical in nature. It is not a competitive test. It is not part of the competitive entry-level testing process. It is purely for psychological purposes to determine whether or not you are at a level to where you're not presenting a risk going into the position of a police officer. So very important in the process, this psychological. Now, through the years, over 25 years training candidates for entry-level law enforcement positions, and within that 25 years, I also served as a hiring authority, an authority to assess entry-level candidates for hiring purposes. Now, my combined experience in those two areas has led me to communicate quite often with police psychologists as well as candidates who have gone through the process and had concerns. So I've had the opportunity to review psychological reports submitted by professionally trained police psychologists assessing entry-level candidates, as well as actually communicating with law enforcement candidates that had issues and problems with their police psychological. So first thing you want to know is that there is a subjective component to any psychological assessment by a professional psychiatrist or psychologist. That subjective component makes it important that you present yourself in the most professional manner possible when you arrive at the office, that doctor's office. You must, if you're going for a police psychological for hiring purposes, you must dress professionally. You should be in business attire. You should be prepared to follow all directions provided. Many psychologists will actually provide a packet or a one-page of information giving you directions as to possibly where you're going to park, what time you're going to arrive, etc. Make sure you follow those directions to a T. Again, your assessment, that subjective component of your assessment, starts from the time you arrive at that site. Now, as you go into the office of the psychologist, you will check in appropriately. You will conduct yourself in a very courteous manner. I suggest that you resist engaging in too much idle conversation with other candidates that are present for their psychological evaluations. Just recognize the fact that you're there to personally be assessed as an individual as to whether or not you're appropriate, whether you're a low enough risk to move on in the hiring process. So, your facial hair, males with your facial hair, this is not the time to have a 5 o'clock shadow. This is not the time to have that beard that you've resisted cutting off throughout the process. Your hair should be neatly groomed. Your face should be neatly groomed. You should be wearing that professional attire, and obviously my female candidates as well. Make sure your hair is appropriate. The clothing that you're wearing, that business suit that you're wearing, is appropriate to show that you're a consummate professional. Okay, so they need to be able to see you, to feel comfortable in recommending you for appointment. They need to be able to see you as a police officer. So I don't want you to conduct this yourself or treat this any different than you would treat your formal interview with the chief of police. You're going to go ahead and conduct yourself in the most professional way. You're going to make good eye contact. You're going to listen to exactly what you're being asked and respond appropriately, being respectful throughout the process. Again, that consummate professional, that perfect professional. Now, the process itself, you need to understand that the psychologist will generally, in most professional processes, will have received a packet from the hiring authority with areas of the most concern related to your background. Most professional psychologists will require that information from the hiring authority so they can conduct a proper and appropriate assessment of you. This particular process is a clinical psychological assessment. Like I said, it's not a competitive process. First and foremost, in your mindset, and this is what's going to help you the most, you need to recognize that you are not competing in this process. You are not trying to be perfect. You are not trying to be the best at everything. You are not trying to create such a positive impression that you're being unrealistic in your responses to questions as well as any type of standardized testing you're taking. They need to be assured that you are normal. They need to be assured that you fall within a range, within tolerances, that you do not present yourself as a significant risk in any area. The way that you do that is by being realistic in your responses. Again, you're not competing. Anything you learned in the entry-level law enforcement testing process, that competitive process to where you sat and you competed against thousands, potentially thousands of other people for those limited slots to move on in a selection process, anything you were taught related to trait assessment, personality assessment, non-cognitive components, in competing and trying to maximize your score, it's time to forget that thought process. And it's time to move on to being mature, reasonable, responsible, accountable for your actions, staying within the realm of possibility with your responses. Okay? So once you get started, once you check in, once they go ahead and provide you with specific directions that you're going to follow to a T, you can expect to be subjected to a battery of testing. Again, not competitive testing, but a battery of testing to assess. At first, usually it is some form of intelligence or aptitude testing to where they're going to subject you to questions in which they're going to challenge you in the questions to see if you can work out problems, figure out math, whatever format of testing they want to use to test your intelligence, they're going to subject you to that type of testing. Do not stress about that. Again, they're not looking for perfection. They're just looking to see that you have at least an average level of intelligence, which if you're now sitting at a psychologist's office having made it through a selection process, made it through the competitive part of the selection process, it stands to reason that you will likely have a reasonable degree of intelligence as reflected in that testing. Don't worry about that. Don't strive for perfection. Do not obsess over it. Yes, you will get things wrong. Yes, there will be things you don't know. That's fine. Next, you'll likely move on to the psychological testing, clinical psychological testing, most often in the form of a personality assessment. Tend to be very lengthy. The most prominent is the MMPI-2, the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, a commonly used assessment. If the psychologist steps outside of the MMPI-2, they generally use other forms of assessment that are kind of modeled after that personality assessment. That assessment which uses statements and true-false responses. So you could expect to have to sit and answer hundreds of statements. Either true, false, or other assessments may have a range of responses, like commonly strongly agree, agree, unsure, disagree, strongly disagree. A basic 5-point scale could even be extended out to a 7-point scale in some assessments. So you'll read the statement. It could be something like, I like making new friends, and you'll either say it's true, false, strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, whatever fits you. They take that inventory of your responses. When that assessment is then scored through a computerized system, it will be broken down into separate scales, separate factors. Those responses actually tie back, in combination, tie back to specific scales. And this is what I want to make clear to you. They're not looking for perfection. They're not looking for you to be the ideal necessarily. What they're looking for is for you not to fall outside of the appropriate ranges. They have built into these assessments, and I'll give you specific areas, they have scales developed to determine whether or not you're trying to game the assessment, whether or not you're engaging in faking. They have generally a lie scale. You've probably heard of that before, a lie scale, a scale designed specifically to determine whether or not you're falsifying your responses. They have generally a defensiveness scale, which is along the same lines to determine whether or not you're providing responses that are outside the realm of reasonableness. They'll have positive impression management on the side of, extreme consistent responses that are to the extreme on the positive side, again, posing an element of being unrealistic and raising a little bit of a red flag. Generally in law enforcement testing, the negative impression scale to determine whether you're purposely putting negative things isn't going to be relevant to you. That's more, for other arenas. But those scales exist within the general trait assessment or personality assessment scales that you can expect, like interpersonal skill, your ability to work with others and enjoy being around others, your extroversion versus introversion. Those type of scales on the norm are not going to be of great concern to you here. You're just going to answer these statements reasonable, responsible, from a mature perspective, being accountable for your actions, etc. You just go in, you read the statement, you answer true or false, whether it fits you or doesn't fit you. Again, stepping back, where do candidates have trouble with these particular assessments? Of course, they have trouble with the lie scale. Of course, they have trouble with the defensiveness scale. And then that positive impression management is sometimes a concern as well. Now, what I want you to put you at ease with is if you go into these particular type of tests and you just approach it from a reasonable perspective, you keep in mind you're not competing, you're not striving for perfection. You're reading the statement and you'll hear you just need to be honest. That's 100% true. You just want to look at the statement, read the statement. If it's something that fits you, it's reasonable, it makes sense, it's true. If you read it and you say, that's not me, it's false. Again, you're not doing an evaluation of what would be the best response. What do they want me to put? What should I put? It should just be an assessment of, does it fit me or doesn't it fit me? Reasonably, is this something that would fit me? True. Reasonably, is this something that doesn't really describe me? False. Stepping over now to the lie scales, the defensiveness scales. Basically, psychologists really shouldn't be eliminating you or not recommending you for appointment because of those particular scales without first interviewing you. There are rare instances around the country to where organizations will subject you to meaning psychologists will subject you to the testing and may disqualify candidates without ever allowing you to be interviewed and explain yourself. That's rare. Why? Because basic professional standards within the industry are that the testing serves as a basis then, along with your background packet, as a basis then to formulate questions for which you were then formally interviewed by the psychologist. It's your responses to those questions when interviewed by the psychologist that is supposed to really be what determines whether or not you're recommended, not recommended, whether or not you pass or fail the psychological. So the lie factor, defensiveness scale could get you disqualified without ever getting a chance to explain yourself. Again, that's not common, but it could happen. How does that happen? Because you as a candidate, if you go in and you get a statement like related to, for instance, your manners at home versus your manners when you're out in a formal setting, and say the statement relates to it being the exact same. Your manners are the exact same at home as they are when you're out in the formal setting. Well, obviously that's ridiculous. Okay, so if you go ahead and you say true to that, that is going to be perceived as ridiculous. Why are you saying true? Well, it's in all likelihood, you are falsifying your response. You're gaming it. You're faking. Okay, so that's fine. You do that for that one statement, and then other similar type statements throughout the inventory, maybe 500-600 question inventory, you go ahead and you answer reasonably. Well, that's not going to be a problem. But say there are 17, 20, 25, maybe 30 statements that tie back to that particular lie scale or defensiveness scale, that faking scale, and you go ahead and you answer more than 50% of them against being reasonable, against being realistic, that then potentially invalidates all of your other responses. That says that you as a candidate, you as someone who's being assessed as an individual, is going ahead and blatantly faking your responses, blatantly lying and being unrealistic in your responses. Now, positive impression management is expected in an employment assessment. They expect that candidates will come in and present their best impression. So the responses will reflect generally a positive impression. Like I said, that's not generally going to get you automatically disqualified. But with these statements that then become unrealistic, especially in combination, you could invalidate the entire assessment. So if the psychologist has to look at your overall assessment with this written testing as being invalid, well, they can't pass you. And that's the mindset of some of the psychologists that, hey, listen, there's not much you can correct within the interview process here now. This candidate has invalidated their testing by lying and faking to the extreme. Therefore, you don't move on and get that personal assessment. Most professionals will take that testing. Yes, there are concerns. Yes, you have a high lie factor. Yes, you have a high defensiveness scale factor. Yes, there is indication of faking within it. They'll take that into consideration along with other concerns potentially that come about in combination between your background and responses you put in that trait assessment, that personality assessment. They'll go ahead now in a formal interview setting, go ahead and ask you specifically about it. So in rare instances, there are candidates that move on to a law enforcement clinical psychological assessment, and they do have significant concerns. Statements related to considering suicide in the past, having suicidal, thoughts at times, and they go ahead and they indicate that, yeah, that has happened. Of course, that's going to be a primary concern sitting on that couch and being assessed by the psychologist. Putting those obvious clinical concerns aside and just looking at the fact of you being otherwise normal person, you answer reasonably throughout, but you go ahead and have too high of a positive impression management approach in taking the assessment, and now your lie factor and your defensiveness scale factor and potentially others are far too high. In a professional setting, that psychologist now is going to talk to you about it, is going to go ahead and ask you questions based on their experience, their training in trying to make a true assessment of you to see whether or not that's something they note in the report, let the department know about it, but still pass you and allow you to move on in the hiring process to get appointed. So again, where are you going to get in the most trouble? Where are you going to have the most problems in a psychological assessment for law enforcement purposes is if you get in your own way. If you go into that assessment trying to game it, if you go into that assessment trying to fake it, if you go into that assessment having received bad information from others thinking that you have to be the perfect candidate, there's a good chance you're going to have that obstacle to get over. There's a possibility, not a great possibility, there's a possibility you never even get a chance to explain yourself, that they just fail you based on the testing and you never get that interview with the psychologist. Okay, so what is the key with that? When you go in and you take, whether it's the MMPI-2, whether it's any other type of personality assessment where you're answering this long inventory of statements about yourself, be reasonable, be realistic, be honest, mature, stable. That's all they're looking for. They're looking for you not to be presented as a risk, as a concern. Now, from the psychological testing and that trait assessment testing, now from that, you're going to go ahead and be subjected in most instances to that formal interview with that psychologist. You must recognize the fact that that psychologist, in addition to having that trait assessment or personality assessment and the report from that, in addition to having your intelligence testing, in all likelihood, they'll make you fill out some form of personal history questionnaire as well about yourself, asking you questions about your past history, etc., likes, dislikes. You may have that type of assessment as well. Once you enter into that interview, now you must be completely honest when asked a direct question. If you in fact lie to that psychologist, again recognizing that they have background information about you, they know areas of concern with your past that should have been provided by the department. If they ask you a direct question, if that psychologist asks you a direct question, and you look that psychologist in the eye and you lie to him or her, you will not pass. Over the past 25 years, I've had the opportunity to speak at length with the most prominent police psychologists in the country. I've had the opportunity to work with and deal with the most prominent police psychologists in the country as an active chief of police, and at lower ranks as a person that was responsible for the hiring process. In talking to them, they say the single biggest factor in a candidate failing a psychological assessment after being selected by the department to move on in the hiring process and potentially be hired is when a person sits and lies to the psychologist. Now, this is how it generally goes down. They'll have information about your past, they'll have assessed your testing, etc. They'll ask you questions about that, and then as the interview moves on, they'll ask you about an issue of concern related to your past that maybe you think they wouldn't know about or thought they didn't know about. They ask you about it and you go ahead and lie. They know the truth, you look them square in the eye and you lie. They give you a chance to clarify it, they give you a chance to change it, they ask you further questioning, and you continue to lie. And then at some point you realize, or they make it clear, they have the information, they know it happened, and you correct it. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, yeah, that did happen. And now you go on to correct it. Where there's generally a misconception is candidates will go through that process, and because the psychologist continues in a friendly manner, even shakes your hand at the end and says, good luck in the process, it gives you the misconception that everything's okay. Well, it's generally not okay. I can tell you in 100% of the instances, it tends to not be okay. The most professional and experienced psychologist will actually prepare a short certification or have you prepare a short statement acknowledging that misconception and acknowledging that lie, acknowledging that it was corrected, which again creates the misperception that it's okay now, and then they'll have you sign it. They'll have you sign that, and that actually ends up being part of the documentary evidence that keeps you from being approved, keeps you from being able to fight and get the position once you're eliminated. So again, you cannot lie to their face. You cannot do it. If you go ahead and do it, there's a good chance you just got yourself eliminated, and that's true in most, if not all, instances. Okay, so know that in the testing, there's no reason to fake, there's no reason to lie. When you're doing the testing, just be reasonable, mature, realistic, stable, etc. It's okay to create a positive impression in your responses. That's expected to a degree, but it just can't be unrealistic. And I gave you the example of your manners at home versus your manners out in the formal setting. It can be simple, like your table manners, for instance. Your table manners at home, out in the formal setting with your boss, executives, etc., whomever, in a very formal setting, you're not going to reach across the table and grab something with your hands. Or pick up, food with your hands and start eating when you have a fork. But at home, that would be something you might not think twice about. So obviously, saying that your manners or table manners at home are the exact same, as out would be ridiculous, completely unrealistic. So that is a perfect example of how a candidate could easily get in his or her own way by going ahead and providing unrealistic positive responses to the degree that it causes an issue on that particular scale and causes you problems. So you get through the testing, you do it appropriately, being reasonable, responsible, mature, stable, etc. Honest throughout. You get into your interview and you realize that psychologist knows more than you think they know. They have the testing to work from. They go ahead and question you. They're going to base, a little bit of a subjective aspect to it. They're going to base whether or not they feel comfortable recommending you for appointment on the responses you provide within that interview. And when I say subjective component, they are trained professionals. They are basing their determination on from a clinical perspective and not just whether or not they personally like you or not, but there is that subjective component as well. They have to feel comfortable and confident that if they go ahead and recommend you for the job, that it's going to work out, that you're not going to hurt people, that you're not going to be a problem. So there is that component as well. And that's where, if you have made mistakes in the past, if you have issues in your background, obviously if the police department felt comfortable enough to move you forward into the psychological, potentially moving you on to being sworn in, then you've made it to that point. The psychologist wants to see you take accountability and responsibility for that. Do not make lame excuses, try to blame other people. Take responsibility and accountability for your actions in the past so that they can feel comfortable moving forward, recognizing that that's your past, not necessarily your future, and they can feel comfortable recommending you. Okay, so a trend in psychological testing, a change in how it's been dealt with as far as the disposition. What I've seen throughout the years is, historically, you had a pass-fail type situation. A person would either pass the psychological, move on to getting hired, or would fail the psychological and would be out in the cold. That was oftentimes considered a kiss of death. If you failed the psychological, it was an extreme hurdle that you were unlikely to get over in the future in trying to get hired. Now, what they tend to do based on litigation, maybe change in professional standards throughout the years, many of the professional psychologists now tend to simply not recommend the candidate at this time. So what the difference is that when a candidate goes for a clinical psychological in a hiring process, and the psychologist makes a determination that he or she is not recommended for appointment at this time, that's not saying that you are unfit to ever be a police officer. That's saying at that moment in time, he or she didn't feel comfortable with moving you forward. So the positive aspect of that, and I've seen this now over and over, because keep in mind, I tend to get contacted by candidates after they've failed a psychological assessment. No prior contact before, all of a sudden I get an email asking what they can do having failed the psychological. And most often they fail because of some type of inaccuracy that they provided, or you could say lie they provided to the psychologist during the interview. Other times they'll improperly, I believe, fail because of test results and they never get to an interview. But most often it's because of that misconception they have in providing ridiculous responses, trying to sound too good to the point that it's unbelievable. So in hiring processes, when you get to the psychological and they have to make a determination, a not recommended at this time, keep in mind, does not mean that you're disqualified forever. It does not mean that you cannot go on and compete in another process or the same process again later on and be approved by that same psychologist. I'm seeing it more and more to where a not recommended at this time, 6 months later, a year later, year and a half later, 2 years later, that same candidate is panicking because they're in a process and they're being sent back to that same psychological firm or that same doctor, and they're concerned that they have no chance in passing. I'm seeing it over and over again where that same candidate not recommended in the past is making it through with no problem their next time around. So again, the change in the determination as far as pass-fail versus recommended or not recommended at this time has been positive for candidates, giving them that second win, that second chance as they move on. So just keep that in mind. But you should have no problem at all with entering into a psychological assessment, no problem in making it through and passing. I can give you from personal experience, all of the candidates I've ever sent in a formal hiring process as a chief of police and lower within a police organization, all the candidates I've ever sent have passed their psychologicals, never had a candidate have any problem at all. And that's generally because most selection processes vet very well. And by the time it gets to you going to that formal clinical psychological, you've already been scrutinized to a degree that that organization is generally confident in the fact that you'll be able to pass. So have confidence, put yourself a little bit at ease, realize that the intelligence testing that you may be concerned because you know you got questions wrong is not that big of a deal. Don't overly concern yourself with your performance on that. Just do the best you can. When you move on to the psychological testing, there are different forms of testing. There are different types of tests. In between, you might have that personal history questionnaire that you just answer questions about yourself, and then you move on to the personality assessment. They're generally lengthy. There's going to be odd statements on them. Again, you're just looking at it from an honest, reasonable perspective. One more point I want to make about that. With the statements, say you have 567 statements that you have to respond to. It takes quite a while to work through them, true or false. As you're going through, if you see a statement and you don't know what it means, why would you ever agree with it or say true. I actually have candidates, and this is not a statement that's on any of the assessments anymore, but in the past, I'll just give you an example. In the past, a statement like, I like to play drop the handkerchief. I like to play drop the handkerchief. I've had candidates years back contact me and say, I had no idea what to put. I think I might have screwed it up. I have no idea what to put. I don't know what it means to play drop the handkerchief. I would literally want to bang my head against the wall and say, what are you talking about? Why would you ever answer true or agree with something that says, I like to, and then you don't know what it is? Think about it logically. It doesn't matter what it says, but I like to, and then it's something you're not sure what it even means. The answer's simple. It's false. If you don't know what it means, then obviously you don't like to do it. Therefore, it wouldn't describe you. So it gets that crazy with these assessments to where people think too much into it. They concern themselves with, what is the best possible response I can put, when in fact all you need to be is reasonable and just put a realistic response. Okay, so keep that in mind. Have a level of comfort going in. Relax. Read the statements. They're very straightforward. I'm familiar with all these different instruments. I know the statements. There's nothing in them that is of any great concern. The most odd statements, the ones that cause you the most concern as far as you don't want to put true because you think it's going to make you look bad a little bit. Most often, they're the defensiveness scale, the lie scale, etc., because they present you with something that's realistic, not great, a thought. It's not something that's going to make you look great. I go back to the example of your manners at home versus your manners out. There's no psychological value to that. It's whether you're lying or not, whether you're being realistic or not. So those are the statements that the candidates tend to struggle over because they don't want to make themselves sound bad, but they really do it. It really fits them, but they don't want to say true because they think it'll make them, again, step back and realize, is it realistic? Is it reasonable? Most often there's no psychological component to that particular statement. It's just there to determine whether you're being realistic or unrealistic. So again, those are the ones that candidates tend to stress the most over, tend to worry about the most, and it's because of that reason. They're the only ones that are the other statements are generally straightforward, easy to respond to, and they're the ones that really tell a lot about you. Okay, I hope this was of assistance to you. I've given the same exact guidance to dozens and dozens of candidates who have had little difficulty at all and have had extreme confidence going into their process. I do not prepare people for clinical psychologicals. So again, that's not something that's available as a service. This is just general advice that has been extremely helpful to a lot of candidates. So, it's just something I hope you take away and benefit from. Again, CCS Test Prep, ccsTest.com is the website. If you do have any questions, info@ccsTest.com. Info@ccsTest.com is my email. Okay, if I can be of assistance to you, just let me know. Thank you.